Dr. Matt Jennings is a professor of history at Middle Georgia State University. He is the author of New Worlds of Violence and co-author of Ocmulgee National Monument, A Brief History with Field Notes, as well as pictorial histories of Macon and Ocmulgee. He edited The Flower Hunter and the People, a collection of William Bartram's writings on the Native American Southeast. And Dr. Jennings has twice served as president of the Georgia Association of Historians. He also currently leads both the Ocmulgee Mounds Association and the Bartram Trail Conference.
All right. Well, thank you, Robin, for the introduction. Thank you to you all for being here. Thank you to Clayton County Tourism as well. This is a really, really nice event, and I'm honored to be included in it. So on a certain level, you already know the end point of the story that I'm going to tell for the next 20, 25, 30 minutes or so, because she was just standing right here in front of you talking about the connections between ancestral homelands and current homelands in the Muskogee Creek Nation. So what I hope to do is show some of the early tentative steps taken by Muskogee and Ute peoples, as well as some of the early steps and, to be frank, missteps taken by non-Native people in attempting to welcome Native guests back to their ancestral homelands. So the narrative is fairly straightforward and fairly well known in Native American history. Non-Native people whose ancestors were responsible for the settler colonialism that evicted Native people from their southeastern homelands quickly pivoted toward honoring the achievements and memory of the very indigenous communities their ancestors dispossessed. The long history of Ocmulgee Mounds National Historical Park in Macon conforms to some aspects of this narrative, but it also diverges in key ways as well. From the inception of the museum, the park's designers recognized the vitality of the modern Creek Nation, or at least that it still existed. And upon the museum's 1951 opening, Muskogee pioneers traveled to Georgia, making a forceful case for the importance of the Ocmulgee site to their nation's past and future. And in myriad ways, Muskogees and Utes have continued to influence the park's exhibits and presentations. The commitment of Native people to remind non-Native people of the continuing significance of sacred sites in forcibly abandoned homelands remains steadfast. So to give away the conclusion in the introduction, the traditional narrative of settler nostalgia and romanticization doesn't work all that well at Ocmulgee. And this is true for a variety of reasons, but the most important one is that at key points from the 1950s onward, Indigenous people would not allow it to happen. While they may have reversed the Trail of Tears, the Muskogees say the road to misery, or Nini Istimerga, the road to misery, in response to invitations from non-Native entities like the National Park Service, Ocmulgee Mounds Association, Macon Bibb County, among others, they seized upon these moments to make their voices heard, to speak in defense of their severed homelands, and to remind anyone listening of their perseverance in the face of long-lasting colonial onslaught. So as soon as the museum is being planned in the 1930s, the designers called attention to the continued existence of Muskogee people. But the people themselves refused to be limited to static display. In spite of some trepidation and even anger among some Muskogees, dozens of Muskogees journeyed from Ocmulgee with a K to Ocmulgee with a C in 1951. And so I'll set a little bit of the scene, and then I'll show you some of the images. The press coverage of the early 1950s is really fascinating, but also really, really troubling. History will reverse itself on November 2nd, 1951, and the red man will invade the territory of the white man, just to give one example. There are beauty contests where dark-haired young women from Wesleyan and Mercer will compete to be Indian princesses. So against that backdrop, dozens of Muskogees come to Macon for the museum opening. Now, rain eventually forces some of the festivities inside, And there is, as far as we can tell, a really wide-ranging stickball demonstration inside Macon's city auditorium. This is a particularly evocative image. This is from Abika Town, which Tracy mentioned in the first presentation. Many of these players are from there. And you see a mix of the early Chuck Taylors and also the GI shoes from the World War II era. I'll also say that the Macon Press describes Muskogee women in fairly, I guess you say, cringe-inducing ways, in possession of shapely brown legs and so on. Another 1950s newspaper quotation. Many Creek Indians who formerly occupied Georgia now live on comfortable farms in Oklahoma and grow corn, wheat, cotton, and potatoes. The women cook on electric stoves, wash their clothes in electric washers, and tell stories of former grandeur by electric light rather than the flicker of a campfire. The women help with light field duties as well as do the housework. The next year, there is a stickball demonstration outside in which Creeks do play against Cherokees. And the Creeks win 12-1 and send 3 Cherokees to the hospital as well. A series of dances put on at the Macon City Auditorium back in 1951. These, as far as we can tell, exhibit a mix of traditional Southeastern stomp dances with the modern kind of intertribal powwow style of dancing that's spreading throughout 1900s America. Muskogee citizens from Oklahoma are among the first guests at the museum. We see them here taking in dioramas, exhibiting various chapters of Muskogee history. One of the most intriguing figures of the 1951-1952 chapter of this story is a Muskogee painter and college professor and children's TV host named A.C. Blue Eagle. And I'll note that I believe he's wearing this kind of Western style headdress because he is sort of attempting to play into the image that non-Native people have of Native people in the 1950s. And that's a big part of it. He MCs this remarkable event inside the city auditorium in 1951. And you can see here him kind of leaning into stereotype, but also kind of pushing back against stereotype. So there's about 6,000 non-Native, almost exclusively white people in the auditorium. And he appears in full regalia before them. And he raises his right hand and, you know, you probably guess what he says. He says, "How?" And 6,000 people just shout it back at him like, "How?" And then he enters into this musical comedy routine in which he claims that he can't woo his lover because somebody's been, quote, fooling with his flute. In his words, "It was truly marvelous to visit the land of my ancestors, to see the ceremonial mound and sacred chamber," it's discussing the Earth Lodge here. "It filled my heart and soul with reverence. I did receive a sacred feeling to deep meaning for my people and my great-great-grandfather." He continued, "The celebration was a more wonderful thing than the people of Macon realize, I think, because in a short time, this talk will get around to all the Creek tribe and will dispel the feeling that a few of the Creeks still hold of hate and resentment." I also can't mention Blue Eagle without talking about him sort of dancing along the line between Native modernity, ancestral traditions, and a kind of open commercialism in his studio art. So, for example, he signs on with the Ross Petroleum Company to produce a series of glassware, with famous Native people on them from the past. And I brought one in to show. This is the Sequoia glass. It was commissioned by Ross Petroleum for A.C. Blue Eagle. Maybe a little bit delicate, but I'll leave it up here if you want to take a look. He also wants to remind Maconites this is not just a cheap show. It shows racial history and is authentic, colorful, and educational. It shows how the Creeks are keeping alive the folk art of their people. So the 1950s is replete with both genuine efforts on the part of non-Native people and Native people, but also wrapped up in sort of the cultural context of Cold War America and stereotype of Native people. The 1970s, as we learned last hour, witness appropriation alongside amplified forms of Native activism among Indigenous people in Middle Georgia. So first, the ugly stuff, and then some of the more promising stuff. There had been a push, in fact, since the 1940s, to invite Native people to come to Ocmulgee and to stay at Ocmulgee, or in the Macon area at the very least. Mayor Ronnie Thompson is one of the architects of this. Today, he's remembered mostly for his steadfast support of Nixon during Watergate, as well as driving a National Guard tank onto the grounds of elementary school during a period of alleged civil unrest in Macon. Sometimes referred to as Machine Gun Ronnie. The groundwork had also been laid by Charles Jones, who was a heavy hitter in Macon's real estate world. How heavy? I teach in the Charles Jones building when I teach. So Jones is imagining this scenario in which folks are coming toward Macon on the highway and considering visiting Macon, and then they change their minds. And here's why. They'll see a display about Ocmulgee at the visitors at the Interstate Visitor Center, and the children will want to come to Macon. That is, until they find out all the Indians are dead. So his solution is, if we can get the Creek Indian descendants, real ones, to come over here on a rotating basis and have the Indians in full Indian dress out there, then a real village operating on the grounds at the monument, and then an Indian trading post selling real Indian-made items from their school in Ocmulgee, we'll have a real tourist attraction. As summer turned to fall in Macon in 1972, the city geared up to host its first ever Creek Week, attempting to turn the Trail of Tears into a Trail of Cheers by honoring returning Muskogees and others, and celebrating the city's sesquicentennial as well. I've got a couple of pieces of paraphernalia from that. Here's one of the medallions that Tracy talked about. And these can only go around. And this is the official pen for Creek Week 1972. I'll get these passed around. The week itself was a bizarre blend of kitsch, faux tribal traditions, and civic pride and boosterism. There are Girl Scout displays, pottery classes, dances by the Boy Scouts Order of the Arrow, and archery demonstrations by some of the Muskogee Rangers at Ocmulgee, scheduled at the same time as fast draw competitions. The film A Man Called Horse played for free at a local theater in the evenings, and corn-themed events featured prominently: cornbread sale, corn eating contest, etc. The parade was thick with thatch huts and tomahawks and teepees, in addition to the many spectators and participants who turned out in fringed leather. And one could also argue buckskins. One could also argue that non-Native people didn't really need an excuse to wear fringed buckskins in 1972, but they were well represented in this crowd. The other side of the coin, so to speak. The Muskogee Creek Nation was reborn in the 1970s. For the first time in a long time, tribal leaders took the reins of their government in a meaningful way. As of 1971, tribal members no longer required presidential approval of their choice for principal chief. And in 1979, as Tracy mentioned, they form a new tribal government. The figure that kind of towers over this period of Muskogee history is Principal Chief Claude Cox, who is one of the architects of the modern Muskogee Creek Nation. And he's pictured here at Ocmulgee on the left side of the screen. He is attuned to the cultural significance of Ocmulgee as a site, but he's also interested in the economic possibilities. And Tracy spoke to the obstacles facing economic development in Indian country in the 1970s. So after being described in local press as, quote, looking more like a cowboy than an Indian, Cox says, we're talking about putting a Creek Indian trading post here in Macon, because a lot of tourists come through here on their way to Florida and to visit Disney World. So he has both the economic and the cultural significance front of mind. Eventually, between 30 and 40 young Native people will move to Macon in the 1970s for varying periods of time, mostly Muskogees, but other nations represented as well. Talked about Eddie George, I'll do that again in a second. There are Choctaws, Cherokees, and Seminoles as well. When asked about the kind of work that these young people will be doing at Ocmulgee, the head ranger quips that, quote, I've got a lot of grass to cut. I've got a lot of grass to cut. And one of the young men, 𝘗𝘠𝘭𝘥𝘴, I'm sorry, 𝘗𝘪𝘵𝑗𝑎𝑎𝑎, 𝘗𝘠𝘭𝘥𝑴 is pictured here. 𝘗𝘪𝘵𝑗𝑎𝑎𝑎 had been promised a job at Ocmulgee and assumed that his years of college and skills as a dancer might qualify him as a guide or interpreter. And he finds out that from the eyes of the park staff, he's mainly useful as a lawnmower. There's some rough language here. I could have cut grass in Oklahoma. I wasn't just some uneducated son of a bitch who couldn't do nothing else but cut grass. I had been to college, Jack. I'd have to call to Macon, Georgia to cut grass. I raised hell about it. Then they moved me up in the office. I worked there as a guide for 3 summers. He's going to go on to complete an undergraduate degree at Mercer and then teach history and art at Central High School in Macon. His wife, Lucille, who's Choctaw, made and sold pottery at the crafts shop. Speaking of which, this is the Creek Indian Trading Post as it existed in the early 1970s at Ocmulgee. And as you learned, Addie George, pictured here, begins her relationship with Ocmulgee back in the 1970s. And when she dies in the early 21st century at the age of 94, she is one of a vanishingly small number of fluent speakers of 𝘗𝘮 language, but also instrumental in preserving the language for the next generation. So recordings of her and other elders form the basis of the 𝘗𝘮 language project today. And that's the aunt that, that Tracy was referring to in the last talk. So Ben, pictured on the last slide, is employed as a tour guide from the beginning. And he has a great deal of fun taking the young people around the site. In his words, the kids were a lot of fun. When I take them around, they can't believe I'm a real Indian. One of them asked me where my horse was. Another wanted to know why I didn't wear feathers. Another little boy rode up on his bike and said, how come you got those kinds of clothes on if you're an Indian? And then he rode away in disgust. Interesting cultural back and forth here. Speaking of which, at this banquet in Macon in the mid-1970s, this elite real estate mogul, Charles Jones, puts his arm around 𝘗𝘠𝘭𝘥𝘴, trying to wine and dine him and so on. And says, can I get you anything? Can I get you anything? And 𝘗𝘠𝘭𝘥𝘴 responds by saying, yeah, give us back our land. By 1976, and so you see some of the progress and then the regression. By 1976, many of the Greeks and other native people who had moved to Macon in 1972 had become disillusioned and had begun to pay their own way back to Oklahoma. Peggy noted, this is Peggy Chakota, who is Cherokee, married to Ben. People would come to the monument and want to see an Indian. Want to touch one. For a while, the chamber had us dancing all over for them. We went along with it until we caught on that they were putting us on for display for their own advantage. We told them we wouldn't do it anymore unless they were to pay us, and they quit asking. At first, I thought they were good intentions. Now I see where they were at, and they were used as tourist draws. She's also described the Indigenous Constitution as presenting a classic image of Indian princess femininity, long hair, high cheekbones, etc. Again, this kind of the physical descriptions of Indigenous women. It may seem odd to note this, but in some ways, the 1990s to the present section, which I'm launching into now, has proven the most difficult to research and write, and it remains the least polished. It's got the most loose ends in it as I prepare this eventual book publication. I think its recency is part of the reason for this, but it's also combined with my limits as a historian to different events that I witnessed or participated in. So I'll put just a couple of highlights and a very low light as I move into the present era. The Ocmulgee Indian celebration began in 1991 as a collaboration between the Ocmulgee Mounds Association, the National Park Service, and the Muskogee Creek Nation. It's been held almost every year since then. COVID forced some drastic changes in it. And a couple of years ago, it was renamed the Ocmulgee Indigenous celebration, just pretty long overdue. Noteworthy here is that in the early years of the celebration, Addie George was one of the dancers, singers, and speakers. So she's kind of coming full circle back to Ocmulgee. In fact, there's a large-scale photograph of her on the wall at Ocmulgee today. So, while one government agency is making great strides in listening to Native voices, honoring Native wishes to a certain extent, another one's moving in the opposite direction. The Georgia Department of Transportation, or GDOT, was planning in the early 1990s to disturb archaeological sites and human remains to move goods across Georgia on its planned Fall Line Freeway. The most damaging part in Macon was to be styled the Eisenhower Parkway extension. Thankfully, local activists and Native partners sprang into action and forced several delays, including the creation of a fairly novel traditional cultural property, or TCP, which Tracy alluded to in the first talk today. This activism, plus the cratering of the Georgia economy in the Great Recession, brought about the death of this project, or the death of this route, at least. And when the death of this route was announced at a 2014 Muskogean symposium in the Creek Nation on the reservation, the audience erupted in applause. It was very clearly a signal victory for the nation here. So this is where the line was posed. If you follow the GDOT story today, they essentially argue that the Fall Line Freeway is finished. You just have to turn like 42 times when you drive through Macon on it, and it's a comical scene. A June 2012 event drove home the connection between Muskogees and Ocmulgee in a particularly forceful way. John Beaver, who was then the director of the Muskogee Creek Nation Museum, Cultural Center, and Archives, orchestrated a bicycle trip from Ocmulgee with a C to Ocmulgee with a K, from Georgia to Oklahoma, to follow the path of the forced deportation of the Muskogees. A large delegation of Muskogees traveled to Macon for the send-off. Elders sang hymns in Muskogee language, prayed in Muskogee language, and George Tiger, principal chief at the time, spoke, describing a vision shared by people forced to leave their lands in the 19th century. So in his words, it was said that when they come back to the original homelands, they'll be much stronger. Next is the send-off. John Beaver is at the left. A Muskogee Vietnam War veteran, Andrew Lowe, joined for the entirety of the ride, and Justin Giles drove the support van and took this picture. At the risk of making things too much about myself, this is me over here. A younger and more hirsute version. After years of NAGPRA-style consultations between the Smithsonian and the Muskogee Creek Nation, several sets of ancestral remains were reburied near the funeral mound at Ocmulgee. Now, while this might seem like a cause for, if not celebration, I mean, given the nature of the event, then at least a recognition that it's better to do the right thing than not, even if that right thing is delayed for far too long. The story behind the reburial is another reminder of the limits of Native power in the face of colonial institutions. While the Smithsonian grudgingly agreed to send some of the Muskogee bodies it held back to their ancestral homeland, it pointedly refused to return all of the bodies removed from Ocmulgee to back to the site or back to the Muskogee Creek Nation. It's a complicated story, but its reasoning here is that because multiple distinct groups of people occupied Ocmulgee over hundreds of years, some of the remains are too old to be Muskogee. So they determined to keep those bodies in a warehouse in Maryland. and we scholars can debate sort of the successive occupation theory and this kind of stuff, but these are still ancestral remains that are above ground right now. So moving toward the present and the conclusion, the 2020s versions of the Ocmulgee Indigenous celebration feature more Southeastern and more specifically Muskogee participation than almost all of their predecessors. Large delegations, including governmental figures, Muskogee Creek Nation Departments of Health, Language, Tribal Preservation, and other offices set up tents and talk to visitors. Muskogee artists and artisans demonstrate their crafts and sell their pieces. And an atmosphere of cultural exchange prevails more than sort of the gawking of previous iterations. A particular highlight was Deb Holland's visit in 2023, and she advocated for full national park status for Ocmulgee. Virtually impossible to make out, but Principal Chief David Hill, his wife Monica, Second Chief Del Beaver, his wife Rhonda. Tracy mentioned ceremonial ground leaders, and this is Felix Brown, who is the Miko of Duck Creek ground. We actually held a stomp dance at Ocmulgee the night before this happened. It's really an incredible event. See National Park Service staff, and of course, everything other. Turn these things Waldo style. Today, the pattern of cultural, political, and economic exchange prevails. Middle Georgia State University, Mercer University, Macon-Bibb County's government, the Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve Initiative, particularly through its Director of Advocacy, who you just met, Tracy Rivas, and the Ocmulgee Mounds Association, have formed the kinds of partnerships that previous generations aspired to. These partnerships manifest themselves in myriad ways, from art exhibitions to film festivals, to Muskogee language street signs downtown, to a Muskogee Creek Nation flag flying permanently at the government center, to a land acknowledgement that seems to break the pattern of performativity, to Muskogee sculpture in a newly formed park, to a planned Muskogee Cultural Center, and a proposed co-management in some fashion of a new national park. Just last night, in fact, Macon-Bibb County celebrated the dedication of this bicentennial park right outside the Ocmulgee Park's entrance. Tracy Rivas was there reading the land acknowledgement. This is Kenneth Johnson, at least his back, and this is his sculpture called 𝘬𝘮𝑗𝑘𝑰, or Mother Ground. And Tracy spoke about Mother Grounds in the last presentation as well. So, as George Tiger put it back in 2012, it is said that our foremothers and forefathers, as they were preparing to make a trip to an unknown land, had a vision. And that vision was that, pardon me, someday the following generations would come back to their motherland and be a part of something. And as I quoted before, when they come back to the original homelands, they'll be much stronger. Current Principal Chief David Hill puts it in these terms. This is where it originally started. It's our history. It's who we are. So the fire that's in your heart is also the fire that's here. Muskogee word for thank you is 𝘗𝘪𝘗𝘮 to Robin and Hendry and Macon County Tourism Authority, as well as thanks to you for being here. And I would love to attempt to answer any questions you have. I knocked AC Blue Eagle for his crass commercialism in producing this glass, but I did read some books if you're interested in them. I brought the 𝘗𝘪𝘵𝘩 history and a picture history as well. So, thank you. Yeah.
We found the land acknowledgement. It's on the Macon City website, or
There are a couple of newspaper stories that quote it at length right around the time it was drafted. If you send me the email, I can send it to you.
okay, thank you.
As well. In retrospect, it's one of the things I probably could have brought in. But I will say, while we're thinking about it, that a lot of land acknowledgements are sort of like weak sauce, kind of performative in nature. These are things that non-native entities feel like we should be doing because we're on the right side of history, we're the good guys or something like that. The coolest thing about Macon Bibs is that it has teeth. And it's drafted with both tribal and Macon Bib voices in it. And it speaks to the severance of folks from their homeland in ways that I think it renders it more meaningful. And I'm thinking about this, especially because just last night, I think academics sometimes have a cynical take on these kind of things. But when Tracy reads this last night, and then Kenneth Johnson gets to describe his sculpture and why it's sitting where it is, I mean, he's choking up talking about it. So I mean, it's clear that this one matters in ways that others might not. Other questions? Making this too easy on me. Yes.
I do have a question about the way we've talked about the 1950s and the 1970s, eras of this. Did they, in a positive way, lay the groundwork for what you just described of where we are today?
I think they do. You don't want to.
I mean, I realize they were not executed like we would do it today, but in their own way, were they trying to do the right thing for their era?
I think they were, and it is I give a presentation in conjunction with the bicentennial, which was in 2023 of Macon-Bibb County, about the centennial back in 1923, and that was weird. There were no Native voices at all in it. Well, there were white people dressed up like Native people, but no Native voices at all in it. So yeah, I mean the architects of the 50s and 70s moments, I think they're trying to do their best within a kind of limited kind of cultural context. To the extent that these things are triumphs, I would argue they're triumphs because Muskogee people sort of make their own voices heard as part of the narrative. So they may be sort of on one level asked to perform a certain kind of Muskogeaness, but they're also using that performance to reinforce their connections to their homelands. And I probably could have done a little more detailed job of this. Tracy mentioned this huge citywide pageant that goes off. It's like an outdoor symphonic drama, so-called. And there actually are Muskogee children who participate in it. On the other side of that, they're not allowed to speak because the people who planned the event said that the history was too ugly. So yeah, I mean, they're recognizing something about the history, but maybe not fully grasping the ham-fistedness of some of their presentations. But yeah, I mean, in terms of trying to do the right thing, yes.
Well, so another 20 or 30 years from now, the people who are talking like we're talking today will be saying those things about what we're doing right now. Probably, I mean, it just keeps advancing.
To me, that's part of our historical scholarship. We approach it with humility, recognizing there won't be last folks to study this. We won't have exhaustive, definitive answers in our time, but maybe we advance the narrative a little bit. Maybe we listen better than our ancestors did, especially for non-Indigenous folks. But yeah. Yes, way in the back. I'm not coming.
Yeah, I just had you mentioned the Cold War context of some of this, and it reminded me of the Mary Dudziak book about Cold War civil rights and how much the international scene was, a part of this. Do you see that sort of similar thing going on with this time period for?
Yeah, I think I'd say to a pretty great extent that's true. There's a Chinese Communist Party delegation that comes to Macon, and Ronnie Thompson won't meet them, because they're the bad guys. But the Muskogees out at Ocmulgee do meet them and walk them around. So I think in a variety of sort of cultural and political ways, Ocmulgee fits into this post-World War II, bipolar world. Yes.
Yeah, so FSU's mascot, like the Seminoles. I know this is not the same nation, and I don't know what type of expertise you have on this, but like there are plenty of like sports teams who like have some Native American representatives like mascot. Like,
Sure.
Is that type of work being done in a way of like collaborating with them?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Now, I'm not going to claim expert status on this stuff, but I can tell you what I tell my students when they ask similar kinds of questions. So part of nostalgizing and romanticizing the past Native Americans is to employ Native imagery for sports teams, universities, pro teams, all this kind of stuff. One thing that most non-Native scholars will try not to do is to step into disputes between Indigenous communities. So Florida State has an agreement with the Florida Seminoles to continue to use the Osceola imagery, to use the Seminole name. The Florida Seminoles are a small group compared to the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma, which has come out against the use of Seminole imagery. So I think it's worth noting that while most non-Native scholars view this as a form of exploitation, caricature, disrespect, it is also not that it's also true that Native America doesn't speak with a monolithic voice on this. Although every national level Native organization, like National Congress of American Indians, for example, comes down against the use of any Native mascotry. And there are a handful of others that have similar deals with Native nations. Utah, for example, is another one. My alma mater did not.
Doesn't it still come down to where they have a voice? Because at FSU, the Seminole tribe there does have a voice, and they have an agreement, and they have figured out how to monetize, to help their nation. So that's what it comes down to, is the local relationships, right?
So from my perspective, it would be I would feel uncomfortable sort of inserting my perspective into an Seminole dispute.
Anybody else have any questions?
I guess sort of like piggybacking off that earlier question about the Cold War context, you had this quote that you read from the 1950s about how, and I'm assuming it was from a newspaper report, talking about how all the Muskogees that have come to the opening, like they live this modern lifestyle.
Right, yeah.
They're like, oh, we've got light bulbs, like we've got all this other stuff. And I was wondering, because you're a lot more like in the archives at this specific place, if this is something that is more of a Cold War kind of American prosperity for everyone message, or if it's a longer, sort of maybe less positive argument about assimilation and like civilization. And maybe that distinction doesn't matter. I don't know.
I think it's both those things at the same time, to be frank. I think there is this There are articles in Oklahoma newspapers saying things like, "You all didn't want the Indians, and now we've got the Indians. They don't want to come back." So still like, projecting this native voice onto people, marveling at the use of electric ranges and things like that. Yeah, I might not have the longer. Oh well, here's a great one about the stickball game. They call, they make some comments about U.S. Indian policy in this article. "We haven't yet smoothed out all the wrinkles," for example. And then the Creeks and Cherokees, quote, "couldn't claim to be full-fledged Americans until they can play ball and like it." So yeah. I mean, whether or not they prove their Americanness by beating each other with sticks, I think is a good question. But yeah, I mean, so I don't have the exact thing in front of me, but there's one quote about like Native people helping Oklahoma into the space age, and now Georgia wants to bring them back and things like that. In the 1940s, Macon city fathers, so to speak, actually write to the federal government asking for Indians to be sent. And the federal government says, "We can't do that." You have to ask the people.
Thanks.